So what I'm talking about here, I hope you're interested in the sort of underlying conceptual framework that we use to think about the benefit from the projects that we've been receiving proposals for in our pilots. And the scheme also, or the same conceptual framework, will carry through to our approach to biodiversity certification as well for farms. And it builds off a global trend towards environmental accounting. You often hear about environmental economic accounting, and it's the full bottle, economic accounting. The tools we're using are the starting sort of steps of that full process for environmental economic accounting, and they're sometimes referred to just by the shorter term environmental accounting without the economic. And that's basically because it's about thinking about the environmental assets we have, vegetation, watercourses, species, all of it, and their condition. So those two steps, thinking about what your assets are, where they are, what condition they're in, that's environmental accounting, and it's not a simple thing to do. And that's before you get on to thinking about the services that those environmental assets deliver to us as people and what that value might be. The good news about the kind of global interest and the national interest in developing these accounts is that they should yield new information systems and a flow of data that we can use, at least for the first two steps, and ideally for all four in time. And that's why we've kind of used that framework as the basis for our pilot work and, in time, hopefully, continued work. So this flowchart here is really the nub of the model. Andrew's already mentioned that we, as part of the project application process, ask proponents to tell us where they're planning to do their environmental planting, draw a boundary around it. Same for enhanced remnant vegetation. Which bit of remnant vegetation are you talking about, and where would you do some planting to complement that remnant vegetation? So we have a good idea about project location. Then we sort of thinking about what benefit you might see from planting trees. I hope most of you would agree that that depends on what's there now, basically. So if you're planting trees into remnant vegetation, you're less likely to see a benefit than if you're planting trees into a cultivation paddock, for example, starting off a low base. So that's the next bit of data that we bring to bear, and I'll talk a bit about how we get a view of current condition. Some of it's from the information we receive through the application forms, and some of it's data that we pull together from other places. Then we think about the activity that the proponent's proposing. So are they going to do a mixed species environmental planting, or are they going to do a planting that reflects the actual community that was there before clearing, as a way to estimate the condition change? So how much closer to that natural undergraded reference state that we use universally when we talk about condition for vegetation as the kind of endpoint, not necessarily the goal, just the benchmark. How much closer to that idea are we going to get by undertaking the project that's been proposed? And here for planting, we're thinking about a 20-year kind of time frame. And we use that local condition change to also model the benefit through connectivity to the surrounding landscape. So if I plant my trees here and it's between two remnants, I'll see greater benefit than if I plant my same area of trees out in the middle of no man's land. Or if I plant a nice solid block that's 50 hectares, I'll see greater connectivity benefit than if I plant a lot of thin shade lines that don't add up to much interior, sort of good for noisy miners and not that much good for many other things. So that gives us a sense of condition change that includes context. Then the next part of the process is to think about the so what. How much should I care about that amount of condition change in that location, which is where we bring in our assets at regional scale. So is it going to improve the condition of an ecosystem that's been depleted by clearing, or one that's already or still quite common in the landscape? And I care more about the one that's been depleted, seeing an increase in condition. Or is it going into a catchment that's had a lot that is already in poor condition, very little riparian vegetation, so I'll see greater benefit to riparian connectivity and protection through planting in that catchment versus one that's already in better condition, for example, and likewise for threatened species. So that's the kind of nub of the model. It's about estimating the condition change by the proposed activity and then thinking about where that is as to how much I should care for change at regional scale. And to get the current condition view and also to get a sense of those priorities at regional scale for ecosystems and watercourses and threatened species, we use land use and land cover data to come up with a segmentation of our regions. So for each of the regions, we've done this process where we've taken state-derived, state-developed land use data, simplified it into a suite of agriculturally focused land use classes. And then we take land cover data, which is soon to be an annual product that we're hoping Geosciences Australia will release, that breaks the landscape down into dense tree cover, less dense tree cover, herbaceous cover, bare ground, those sorts of classes, to come up with these 25 assessment units across each of our regions. And I should say that that process also includes remnant vegetation. So class 1 is remnant vegetation. So we know what's remnant vegetation, what's treed grazing land, what's bare cultivation land, and those sorts of classes, what's plantation forest versus native forest that's being used for silviculture, for example. That's what that looks like at a more zoomed in scale. And then we take CSIRO's Habitat Condition Assessment System, which is also soon to be publicly released, and it's the best national condition data set we have for vegetation. It's based on a long satellite image archive combining MODIS and Landsat and all sorts of other available data sets, giving us an estimate of the average condition of our 250 metre pixels in that HCAS data set, which is shown here on the middle left for this particular part of the Burnett. Based on data from 2001 to 2018, we use that HCAS data set, which is good, but not quite there yet for farm scale assessment of vegetation. And we estimate the average condition of those land use and land cover segments. So that gives us a kind of colour by numbers condition map for our region, which we can then run our configuration model on to get the connectivity component of condition and come up with a regional account for ecosystems, for species, as well as for riparian vegetation by catchments. So we can say which catchments have the lowest average condition, which pre-clearing ecosystems have the lowest pre-clearing condition. And we can then use the species area curve, which is sort of a non-linear relationship that's the closest thing that us ecologists have to a law, to drive benefit or recognise a greater benefit to condition change for those systems that have been more heavily cleared or those catchments that have had more riparian vegetation removed. That gives us that priority component in the model that I've repeated in the step above here. So we go from project location to get a sense of current condition. As I said, that's a combination of the data that we get through the application as well as that model that I've already shown you for the veg condition based on those land use and land cover segments. We think about the actions that have been proposed, and for planting, there are two broad types of activities, one of which is getting closer to that undegraded reference than the other, to give us an estimate of future condition, model the connectivity benefits of that condition change, and then use these regional maps of priority to think about the benefit at regional scale to our assets of ecosystems, riparian veg, and threatened species habitat to quantify the likely benefit of our projects. For C+B, we also had a small factor for the protection of remnant trees, so paddock trees, and there was a little bump given to the overall benefit score for those projects that were protecting a lot of remnant paddock trees, but that's the broad model. Hopefully that makes sense.